Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ThatOneSecGuy's podcast. Friends, financial technology or FinTech is revolutionizing the way we manage our money. But with great innovation comes great responsibility, especially when it comes to safeguarding sensitive financial data. So today, we're thrilled to welcome a true leader in the FinTech security space, Mr. Hilal Ahmad, the esteemed Chief Information Security Officer of razorpay. Hilal is a seasoned cybersecurity expert with a proven track record of securing complex financial ecosystems and has been at the forefront of developing cutting edge strategies to combat ever evolving cyber threats in the fintech world. Welcome to the show, Hilal. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Harshil. I'm doing great today, right? So, and thanks for having me.
Lovely. So, Hilal, we would absolutely be looking at a wealth of knowledge to be obtaining from you today, and I'm sure the listeners would have a plethora of insights to be gaining from the episode. So, without wasting any more time, let's get started.
Yeah.
So, Hilal, with the rise of fintech, right, security has definitely become paramount, right? So, can you tell us a bit about the unique challenges that CISOs are facing in the fintech industry?
So yeah, fintech industry as such, right? So has always been under the spotlight, right? So for obvious reasons, right? And has to be because we deal with financial instruments like money, wallets, things like that, right? So which require a lot of diligence from our side in terms of not only safeguarding it, but also making sure that, okay, we do not have any kind of loopholes in the system that can be taken advantage of. Right. So, in order for fintechs to basically do the security properly, there are a lot of different drivers. Right. So, the challenge that CISOs face is basically okay, the nature of the business as it is. Right. So, which is a kind of like highly regulated area. So, meaning that we get basically a lot of directions from different regulatory bodies on how to do security. Right. So, and what are the basic elements of security that are actually required on a on a high level, right? So the fintechs also do not have like it's not any different from any other industries. We still need to basically like apply the foundational security principles, like something like access management, something like encryption, something like data security and privacy, something like edge and parameter firewalls and things like that,
Hmm.
right? So from that perspective, so we are all the same. Right? Every industry requires those building blocks, right? So, but at the same time the fintech has like additional responsibilities towards making sure that the data privacy and data security gets highest basically attention in order to safeguard because we are the custodians of user data, and for
Right.
us user trust means everything, right? So our business is actually basically trust, right? So if for example we do not maintain that trust, we should forget about actually doing business in fintech. So
Absolutely.
it's as simple as that, right? So we take security and compliance and privacy as our number one priority in the organization, and it's a good place to be because everybody is sensitized about it. That what is the requirement for security, compliance, and
Hmm.
things like that, and we get the required support from basically the management or basically our employees, right? So they get sanitized about it, right? So what is actually a challenge is basically like you have the fintech, particularly when money is involved, right? So you have all sorts of new threat vectors and new attack vectors actually coming along, right? So you
Hmm.
have to be always one step ahead of your adversaries, right? And
Right.
because of the changing nature of basically these attack vectors, which is like a lot more frequent than any other industry, right? So we have to be always updating the technology, updating the processes, and updating all the frameworks that we use
Right.
to be able to basically like make sure that we are always one step ahead, right?
Hmm.
So those are basically the challenges that are uh, uh, something specific to basically security in fintech.
Very interesting. So, Hilal, if I'm not wrong, you come from a very SOC background from your early career. Is that right?
You could say that because I have always been fascinated about this defensive aspect of security, right?
Hmm.
There are a couple of reasons for that. It's there earlier when I started my career, being an office engineer was not like a big deal, right? So you could get tools, you could have and number of open CVs and things like that, right? So you could potentially like hacking systems, right?
Right.
So, but it was always important because from my point of view, it was always important to stay one, make sure that, okay, we do not allow basically like adversaries a free hand, right?
Right.
So I
Right.
was always interested in building those defensive technologies, detection technologies, and things like that, to ensure that, okay, the organization remains actually safe and secure. So yeah, you're right. So and SOC remains always like one of my core areas of competencies because there is it's an ocean, right? It's not like one aspect like you actually said, okay, then. And
Right.
SOC is not like some other domain, right? So you can never say that I'm finished. Right? There is no such thing as, okay, I achieved some
Hmm.
goal, right? So it's always
Yes.
evolving. It's always like open ended.
Right.
So if
Right.
you like, you have one way of actually stopping an attack, tomorrow there's another way of stopping that.
Okay.
And surprisingly, like most of the innovation that has happened in the last decade is actually related to SOC. So you
Hmm.
can see that all the things that you hear about, all the buzzwords that you think about, SASE, you think about zero trust, you think of
Yes.
anything, right? So it has got to do something with basically security operations, right? So
Yep.
meaning that like all the innovation, all the creativity has been actually spent on that. So
Absolutely.
not that the other are basically part of the security are have not evolved, right? I think they have, but most of the innovation has been happening in security operations, and that's why the fascination with being in security operations.
Agreed. Agreed. Absolutely. So, let's talk a little more about security operations centers, since that's your entire powerful arsenal toolkit. And, I wanted to understand from you, how is the modern SOC different from the traditional models, and how does it address the fintech challenges specifically?
So if you look at the evolution of SOC, right? So we started basically with something like a signature-based detections, right? So you have fingerprinting, your signature-based, all of those indicators of compromise that you see, right?
Hmm.
And we had very hard set rules, right? So if actually the endpoint, whatever protection that you had, if it detected that, great, right? So that was based on the signatures, right?
Hmm.
And any kind of hashes or any kind of rules that you actually deploy, that was the first stage or first phase of basically like security operations, right? Then obviously it evolved, and we saw basically like then behavioral based, or you can say that anomaly based detections and things like that. So now we evolved, right? So we say, okay, now we are no longer basically like taking only signatures or hashes into consideration.
Hmm.
We have to basically think about basically like anomalies and behavioral based detections. Something as simple as like a fileless malware, right? So for example, you have to detect that which has no signatures, obviously
Right.
cannot basically be detected through like normal techniques, right? So
Hmm.
when you have such a challenge like that, which is very common, right? So what do, right? So you cannot use basically signature-based detection. So then you
Yes.
use basically behavioral-based and you use basically anomaly-based detections, right? So now, in order for is this to basically that was the second phase of basically evolving SOCs, right? So now we are
Hmm.
actually something we have evolved even further, right? So I'm not sure like how the industry has actually adopted all of those practices, but everybody's going through basically database and SOCs, right? So you have risk-based SOC, you have database SOC, you have intelligence-based SOC, and you have
Right.
all different kinds of SOCs, right?
Hmm.
Now, in order for us to be efficient in our incident response, right, or even detection engineering or threat hunting, right, it's always important that we actually combine all of these techniques. So even though like the signature-based detection um, is there, right? So, but it's by default. Like you will have it by default. So it's no longer like you have to work on it. You actually
Right.
expect it to be there.
Yes.
But now what has happened is that like now we are actually becoming a lot more optimized. So we are becoming more. We actually try to figure out, okay, how can we be more predictive or
Hmm.
preventive rather
Hmm.
than actually being detective, right? So how do we actually bring intelligence into picture? How do we do actually enrichment of our indicators, right? So all of the things that we actually need to use, right?
Right.
And I think the modern SOC is heavily dependent on the quality of the data that we actually receive from sources. So
Hmm.
that means that if we do not have enough quality data, so a lot of our tools actually do not actually produce quality results.
Right.
And earlier, like it was okay for people to have a massive amount of false positives, right? But because of the challenges in hiring good quality talent, and we do not scale teams a lot,
Hmm.
right? So we have limited number of specialized people who can actually look at it.
Right.
So that modern SOCs actually do not necessarily depend on basically the people a lot. Now they have automated tools to basically take care of that. So I
Right.
think that's a welcome change because now we can actually cover more ground with basically like automation and orchestration rather than actually basically like having people actually doing the uh, basically all the detection, right? So in summary, basically like now earlier it used to be a reactive kind of like SOC,
Hmm.
then it became like a behavioral or anomaly based SOC, and now we are in a predictive or basically preventive
Absolutely.
kind of SOC, right?
Yeah.
So and it requires different things to come together to be able to do that, right? But
Yes.
yeah, so
Yes.
that's the state of the SOC today.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that we have come a long way from just signature based. Now we get into complete behavioral analysis, even when it comes to alerts, right? Like, who
Yeah,
am I plus IP config is for sure an alert because that's not a normal
yeah,
behavior of any user or for any program for that matter, right? So yeah, we have come a long way from there. And of course, like you said, data sources play a very critical role in making your SOC be as powerful as possible. But another side of it, I think these days, which is upcoming, is the detection engineering side of it, right? Which is also a very powerful SOC enabler, in my view. So,
right.
can you explain? I mean, how detection engineering strengthens a modern SOC?
Yeah. So you can think of it like this: why threat hunting stops, right? So detection engineering actually starts, right?
Okay.
So whatever we discussed so far is basically like signature-based detections, right? So behavioral or something like that. So all of that is basically some of it is basically consumed for threat detection, right? Now, basically all of the other things that are basically like anomaly detections or
Hmm.
anything that's unusual going or suspicious going in our basically like infrastructure, right? You cannot do that through basically the threat hunting because for threat hunting you need indicators of compromise, right? So if the
Yes.
indicators of compromise are not there, you cannot necessarily basically do any investigation or any instant response.
Right.
So detection engineering becomes like a massive advantage for SOC analysts, right? So, or SOC engineers.
Hmm.
So what it does is basically like you have a platform built basically to be able to to do kind of like the investigation in specific kind of incidents, right? So you are doing, uh, for example, like you sift through all your logs that you have to understand if the pattern matches something that's actually going to be malicious.
Hmm.
You mentioned earlier about certain commands that you actually give at the terminal, which may not necessarily be something that an ordinary or a normal user will actually execute, right?
Yes.
So something like that, how are you going to detect that through basically signature-based detection? You can't, or through iocs you can't, right? So in order for you to basically establish that particular behavior is actually like anomalous or it's actually like suspicious, you have to basically deploy your detection engine and capability. So which means that there are multiple things that you are going to do, right? So you're actually like going to create a profile of a normal user saying that a normal user will do this and this and he will not do this and that,
Hmm.
right? Similarly, a particular machine is expected to basically like do certain tasks or certain things that are going to be normal or a baseline or a benchmarking for those particular things, right? It is not expected to basically go beyond that, right? So
Hmm.
you actually create that benchmark to understand if that machine is actually being acting suspiciously or not, right? So
Right.
all of those things actually are not required, were not earlier required to be done, but for basically like in incident response, because earlier what you are concerned about is that okay, if there's a breakout of malware or breakout of some kind of infection, so you contain that, quarantine that, or remove that, and then do the investigation. Now you do the investigation on the fly. So
Hmm.
you don't wait for basically containment and things like that. You are actually
Correct.
being a little bit more proactive to
Yes.
be able to understand if your network is actually behaving properly. So in fact, like earlier, it's not something new that we are doing now, right? So I think the flow analysis like net flow or open flow analysis or something like that, right? So these technologies were always available with us, right? But
Yes.
most of these actually did not get used because of certain limitations. One was basically we did not understand them fully.
Hmm.
Second is that it was highly costly, right? So basically to analyze those kind of information, the logs that we actually get through network logs and things like that, it was very costly, right? So now we have brought that cost down, right? So now the effort is also less, right? And there
Right.
are much better tools basically to analyze that, right? So why we are doing that now, even though it was basically been there forever, right? So it's because now we have evolved. The detection engineering has evolved. Now we have got newer sources of information, right? So that we can utilize, right, in detection engineering. And think about it, right? So earlier, hardly anybody was basically talking about eBPF and other protocols, right? Now everybody is talking about eBPF, right? So the reason for that is because now we have better understanding of that. So which obviously like benefits the detection engineering pipeline that you have, right? So you
Mm,
can actually set the patterns, set what is normal, what's not normal, say understand what is the normal behavior for a machine or a user, and basically detect and then deploy those alarms, and then say actually doing that.
mm.
So I think all of those things can combined actually provide a massive advantage to basically security analysts and in combination with threat hunting.
Interesting. Interesting. Hilal, the last time I met, I asked a very interesting question, and this was when we met in person, right? And I asked a very interesting question, and I did get definitely a very new perspective from you. And I'm going to ask the same thing again so that,
So,
we have that same perspective shared with the wider audience and the listeners, right? So the question that I had asked at the time was, we have three elements, right, in the organization: people, process, and technology, right? And when there are people that need to be upskilled or developed, there are awareness sessions. In order for us to fine tune our processes, we have regular audits, we have maturity, etc. Now, what about technology? We might implement the most powerful XDRs, EDRs, but how are we fine tuning them? uh, and what is the process behind it? Like, we are doing purple teaming, but exactly how are we fine tuning the technologies that lie, and whom we are completely reliant upon for all of our detections of IOCs and any of the alerts? And one of the things that you definitely said at the time was chaos engineering. So that was a very interesting point for me.
yeah, I think, see, for any, chaos engineering is something that's actually beneficial for the entire engineering, not just security, right? So, what that means is basically like, you know that you have basically built a state of the art security infrastructure, right? But how is it performing? So what you can have all sorts of metrics, right? So okay,
Hmm.
MTTR, MTTT, you can have number of vulnerabilities discovered, number of vulnerabilities fixed. You can have all sorts of different things that basically like you calculate to understand if you actually are reducing the risk or not, right?
Right.
But what is the guarantee? What is the validation that you get? So how do you validate whether the
Hmm.
10 vulnerabilities I discovered are exactly, am I facing the only those 10 vulnerabilities? Right? I may have 100 which I did not discover. Right?
Yep.
Similarly, there are like I may actually be very good at basically like detecting the OWASP token kind of vulnerabilities, right?
Yep.
So at my WAF, right? So but how do I know that my application is only vulnerable to those kind of attacks, right?
Correct.
So
Yes.
in order for us to basically like really test the infrastructure that we have deployed, we need to introduce chaos engineering in some format, right?
Hmm.
So meaning that like I know how I built my system, right? Can I break it? Let's say
Hmm.
can so which means that I introduce actually like fault injections within my systems to understand like if my infrastructure is able to detect those basically signals, right? Say
Right.
for example, like I have basically created a rule in my SOAR or in my SIM or somewhere, right?
Hmm.
That I'm going to be detecting this particular malware,
Hmm.
right? So how do I test that? The first thing I can test is basically just inject the malware, but you cannot do that, right? So in order for you to basically really test your systems, you want to understand how far I can stress
Hmm.
test that particular system, right?
Right.
So that's why I think it's important to basically understand, like we deliberately actually like test our systems against basically the faults that we expect it to handle, right? So if it's not able to handle that, that there you actually your validation, right? So it's not
Hmm.
able to
Hmm.
handle that.
Correct.
And what are the different variations, right? So you have what if, for example, all the vendors and all the partners that we work with, the OEM partners that we work with, I said I'm 100% sure that they do like a thorough testing of their platform, right? So there's no doubt
Independent
about
testing.
that. Yeah, they do a lot of testing, but at the same time, you are also not very sure, right, if their test coverage is actually going to be complete or not,
Hmm.
right? So meaning that like we have to understand that if they have tested a particular malware in one particular format, right? So you have polymorphic, basically like viruses. You have polymorphic
Yes.
malware. You have like polymorphic ransomware, things like that.
Mm.
You change certain bits here and there, right? So it changes entire basically like shape and format. So
Right.
you know that like they have tested it, but have they test all the variations, right? So in order for us to do that chaos engineering, we actually put all those formats in those testing. So which means that most of this chaos engineering, or basically like sometimes like we also use that as part of red teaming.
Mm.
So when we do that, like exploit development and things like that, the reason for us to do that is to basically like, be absolutely sure that we are actually testing the platform against unknown threats that it does not expect,
Mm. Mm.
and see how it actually responds. So
Okay.
that's essential because when I actually build my anomaly detection platform, right? So one of the things that I'm always sure about is basically that my rules may not be exhaustive, or the patterns that I have built may not be exhaustive. So what
Mm.
if we have a different format of attack? Can
New
it
type
actually
of attack.
detect that? So exactly, right? So or zero day for that matter, right?
Yes.
So what are
Mm.
the chances that we're actually going to basically detect those, right?
Correct.
So which is that's why it is very important to have chaos engineering in place to basically not just test your system but also validate their efficiency.
Interesting. Okay. And what about deception technology, Hilal? Because I recently had a chat with a friend who has a completely contrasting opinion to me. So I come from a more offensive security background, and the colleague I was speaking to is more from a threat hunting background, right? And he was a complete pro deception technology guy, and I feel deception technology is an overkill for most organizations unless it is at that level of maturity, right? So, in your view, what kind of a role does deception technology play? Is it extremely significant, or do you see its real value?
Actually, you nailed it when you said that the organization needs to be at a certain maturity level, or the security infrastructure or the teams need to be at a certain maturity level,
Hmm.
or even the business needs to be at a certain maturity level to be able to fully utilize deception technology. First of all, it's not for everybody,
Hmm.
right? So, like let's make that clear, right? So, deception technology essentially is basically a tool for you to kind of like understand if there are any persistent threats or any kind of attacks that are executed against you, which is a set parameters, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, like, let's say, for example, right? So, you want to identify if you're basically like a nation state actor is basically trying to basically sabotage your systems, or
Okay.
somebody is trying to basically like execute a targeted attack against you. How do you do that? What are the different ways you can do that? So on a normal incident response process, you do not have your data limitation goes to basically like daily, weekly to monthly, right? So or it may even go to like a quarterly, something like that, right?
Hmm.
But you may not go back like 1 year back and see and understand like how these things are actually working. So this is where the deception technology methodology actually works really, really well. So the reason for that is basically put the deception engineering platform itself can assist and aid you in actually figuring out if there have been like a targeted attacks against you, right? So
Hmm.
you can actually see okay who is actually doing that, right? So and you can sort of like build your kind of like a data platform to understand the patterns between attack and defense and see which parts of your infrastructure are getting most targeted or most. You could potentially find that from the incident response, but from the deception engineering, you could also see that okay, if there is normal traffic actually that's hitting you, that might be actually malicious over a period of time. So in most of the targeted attacks, it's not going to be like a single burst of attack,
Hmm.
right? So it's going to be basically in installments, right? So you are going to have one installment now, one installment the second, third, fourth to basically, for example, reconnaissance, for example, they are actually like discovering your network itself. They may not do nmap and basically like blacklist their IPs, even if like, so that defeats the purpose of basically doing that, right? So
Right.
now they want to understand it passively. They want to basically like gather as much information about your networks, about your systems passively, right?
Hmm.
So they will always go like a normal request and things like that, right? So you would potentially not find them through basically like your detection rules, like identify anybody who's running nmax scans against us, right? So you will not find that. So,
Hmm.
but when you actually have a deception engineering platform, what it does is it actually catalogs that. So you will see if somebody's actually trying to scan like 10 requests today, 10 requests tomorrow, 10 requests day after, right? So you see that pattern actually building. So you will actually
Yes.
be asking yourself, okay, why is he actually like every single day trying to do this,
Correct.
right?
Okay.
So even though those requests are coming normal, but you actually build a case against that, and
Understood.
that's where it becomes very, very valuable, right? So you will
Okay.
actually find the malicious adversaries targeting your systems through basically in a passive manner, right? And that's what it actually requires. And also, it does not spook the adversary also,
Hmm.
right? So you don't actually block his IP. You don't alert him that okay, you are
Yes.
actually getting monitored and you are going to get blocked. So it
You're
gives
collecting the
him that
activity.
flexibility to, yeah, exactly. You let him do all of this, whatever objectives that he has. At the same time, you collect data against him
Hmm.
to better understand what his methodology is and what his end goal is, right? And you build your defenses accordingly, right?
Right. Right.
And that's why it's very, very important. So, but again, it's not for everybody. So if you're not basically an industry where the target attacks are not executed like frequently, or your systems are not in the critical path, right?
Hmm.
So you probably would wait for it to be implemented. Of course, like everybody should implement at some point, but it should not be like, okay, the first thing I do when I'm building my security infrastructure is basically deploy a deception engineering platform. So
Okay.
it should come at its appropriate time, not early, not late, but when exactly it's appropriate.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting. I mean, yeah, this is definitely true that it helps you capture novel patterns of APT groups and
Yeah.
state-sponsored attacks, and definitely there are certain type of things that might get out of the detection that we have already built, like from XDRs, EDRs. But this might be able to recognize that there is something definitely an anomaly type of a pattern happening here on your network logs. So yeah, I mean, yes, this is definitely true, but does it justify the cost of how much deception technology takes? I mean, there has to be a ROI attached to it, right? So,
It depends, right? So, for example, if you're a defense establishment, no amount of ROI is going to be like too much,
hmm,
right? It's always going to be important. If you have like a critical infrastructure like electrical grid or water systems and things like that, right? So it's obviously highly justified, right?
okay,
Similarly, like it's going to be always like justifiable, right? So but in a startups, right? So or something like an industry, I mean industry is also needed, right? So in order for us to understand what is the ROI for deception technology, right? So one of the things that's important to understand is how much am I vulnerable to basically like these kind of attacks like APT groups or ransomwares or say for example nation state actors. Right? So I have to
right,
understand that if I'm basically vulnerable, and have I seen this actually happening in the past, right? So once I have actually like understood that, right, so then it becomes a question of okay, what is the effort necessary to basically like make it functional, and what's the investment that I need to make, right?
hmm,
So the investment that I need to make is always going to be either buy versus build, right? So you can build your own systems. You don't necessarily need to have a deception technology that you have to buy, right? So and it also depends on what kind of deception system you want, right? So if,
hmm,
for example, you want to build like honeypot plus analytical solution, you
right,
can do it on your own, right? So if you want to build like a honeypot plus basically honeypot plus analytical platform plus intelligence, right? So that may actually cost you a little bit of money, right?
right, right,
So but it again depends on what is your basically like I mean tolerance for basically like investing in a technology like deception engineering, right?
hmm,
So for some industries like financial, like banks, like ICDs, defense, I think it's always justifiable. But at the same time, like you can potentially achieve these targets if you actually build your detection platform in a much more robust way. Let's say, for example, you do not want to have A to B, B to C, or C to A correlation, right? So you can have auto correlation built in,
right,
and that
right,
would do exactly the same job as a deception platform, right?
correct.
But at the same time, your detection platform needs to be mature as well, right?
Yes,
So it's always going to be
a
debatable depending
trade-off.
on where you are working. Yeah. So where you are working and what the industry actually needs or what your organization particularly needs, right?
Correct.
But
Hmm,
if I am actually confident, okay, it brings the value that I need for my organization to do better, right? So obviously I will justify that. But at the same time, like I said earlier, like it's not like a stage one or stage two deployment. It has to be always a stage three deployment
hmm,
where you have basics plus advanced. It's like a kind of like an optimization solution that you do on top of everything else. right?
Right,
So
right.
that's where it actually gets much more visibility.
Great, great. Interesting. Thanks, Hilal. I mean, that was amazing. So, Hilal, as part of That One Sec Guys podcast show, from time to time in our episodes, we conduct a rapid fire round session. So, we have a few questions that we have prepared for you. And if you're ready, then we can shoot that start.
Yeah, fire away.
All right. Okay. So, the question number one is, which would you prioritize for a critical zero-day vulnerability and why? Would it be patching or would it be detection?
um, Detection.
Detection. And why would that be so?
Because we potentially might not be aware of 0 days like before it actually hits us, right? So there's no point in actually building a 0 day platform defense like a platform, right?
Fair
So on
enough.
the other hand, the detections can actually like have much more wider scope,
Hmm.
and that will be able to basically act in novel situations that we have not encountered before, right?
Hmm.
And
Yes.
I have flexibility in my detection platform and detection rules to basically build things that I do not actually like visualize or I do not have monitoring based on, right? So which means that I have basically some rules deployed that could potentially take care of any unknown threats or any attacks depending on the anomaly or suspicious behavior that could be
Right.
potentially as a result of zero data.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Question number two is cloud versus on-premise security. What are your biggest concerns when securing a fintech app in each of these environments?
This is a tricky one because I believe that both of them have advantages and disadvantages. Like personally, I feel um, I don't have a really a preference, right? So because I've seen like in cloud where you are not sure about your attack surface area, like how big it is, like so there's always going to be questions around
Right.
what is my attack surface area, right? On That's actually something that on-premise actually provides me. I know exactly like what my attack surface area is, right?
Right. Okay.
So there's an advantage there, right? So at the same time, like the management and procurement is going to be
Hmm.
incredibly like difficult in on-premise. I don't know what tool I will need and how soon it will actually get implemented, or
Okay.
at the experimentations I need to do or the rules that I need to build will be difficult on the on-premise, while as it's actually seamless in cloud platform because all I have to do is basically write a Terraform script and just execute it,
Hmm.
right? So meaning that like there are going to be trade-offs between two. So I really do not have a preference between either of them.
There's no A or B over here. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. All right. Third is a very common question, which is what keeps you up at night more? Is it the insider threats or is it external attacks?
Again, a tricky one, right? So I think yeah, it's a very tricky one. Trust me, right? So, but yeah, an insider threat would be always like something that's going to be more challenging because
Okay.
you know for sure that the insider has access to the information that could potentially harm us if it gets breached.
Right.
Right. So on the other side, right? So attackers which are external to my organization.
Okay.
So that's more or less like okay, if I build my defenses properly, I can potentially have a better defense against it.
Hmm.
But on the insider threat part, right, so it's always going to be difficult to basically, no matter how much data loss prevention solutions you have, XDRs or EDRs you have,
Right.
insider users always have a way of actually getting around it, right?
Yes.
So there's always potential for somebody to basically think about, oh, this is how I'm going to basically export the data, even
Right.
unknowingly, right? So not all employees are going to be malicious. Their intention is not always malicious. Actually, like to be honest with you, I am yet to basically meet an incident where an insider attack happened because the intention was malicious.
Oh,
Most
really?
of these most of these things happen because they felt that that was the best way to share information, or they had the best of intentions at heart, right? So they really did not actually have a malicious intent, but data still got breached, or people
Hmm.
still got access to the code because they thought this was the
Yes.
fast and the most efficient way of using it, right? So
Right.
that's what keeps me awake because insider users, even though they may not have bad intentions, but they can still get tricked into some of the situations which may not be ideal.
Right, right. And I think it makes complete sense, right? Because insider threat would personally also be a more challenging thing to deal with because of three primary reasons, right? One would be that the wider access to the organization's internal resources. Of course, they are non-technical people sometimes. We deal with all sorts of departments. Secondly, there could be someone who has complete knowledge of the internal working of the systems, right? So
Yeah,
that is definitely more difficult to deal with. Absolutely
absolutely.
agreed. All right. Moving to the fourth question, encryption versus anonymization, and when dealing with sensitive financial data, which approach do you prefer, and under what circumstances?
Okay, so this is again a tricky thing. So encryption, because I am personally like very fond of encryption, right? So all the protocols and algorithms and things like that, right? So I
Right.
think that becomes like a primary tool for in all the things we do in security, right? So it's always going to be preferable, right? But
Right.
at the same time, like so, encryption may not be always the ideal thing to do when you're actually using the data or you are kind of like processing the data. So anonymization is going to be extremely important when you are dealing with super sensitive data like personally identifiable information, the PII, or any kind of financial information, because you cannot like give the entire thing to users and they may actually misuse it or things like that. So
Mhm.
anonymization is actually extremely important in those cases, right? Encryption, on the other hand, is going to be your defense and depth kind of like strategy, right? So even if your data does actually get breached or it gets exposed, right? So if it is encrypted, nobody will actually use that data. So both of them have their own basically like usage, and I don't think that it is kind of like either an or kind of like a solution, but it can be like encryption and anonymization
They
would
need
be
to go
actually
hand
much
in
more
hand.
preferable. Correct. Yeah.
Right, right. Okay, brilliant. So that brings us to the end of the rapid fire session. Thanks, Hilal, for doing this. Overall, Hilal, this has been a wealth of knowledge for both me and our listeners. We truly appreciate you taking your time and sharing your expertise on modern SOCs, detection engineering, and the unique challenges of the fintech industry. And as the threat landscape evolves, right? What key takeaways would you leave with our audience to help them stay secure?
Yeah, I think the biggest message I would actually want everyone to have is that never ignore the basics, right? So always make sure that you have a very good hygiene around your basics, right?
Right,
So make sure that like if you're like missing something, right? So you actually like that should be your first priority, right? So before actually like it's like this, right? So before actually like implementing a sim, right? So and, like you should have logging actually in place,
right,
right? So
right. Yes,
yeah, so all of those things are very very important, right? So take
yes,
care of the basics, that's very important, and do not ignore the security principles like uh, separation of duties, least privilege, defense in depth, and things like that, right? So because that will always come to your basically that will always help you in getting out of tricky situations, right?
right,
And those are the things that you should when you are building a very like a good security architecture, right? So always make sure that you keep those things in mind,
right.
and those security principles are there for a reason, right? So and
Absolutely.
when you're building something subconsciously, always make sure that you account for those things, because that's the only right way to basically build a security infrastructure.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Hilal. That's great insights. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode. And if you like to hear from more cybersecurity experts on different insights that they bring from their industry, please do consider subscribing and liking to the video. And until next time, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Harshil. Appreciate it.